Hello and welcome to the third session in our financial crime discussion series titled AML Legislative Trends in Europe. Before we begin, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items for you. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so for the best audio quality, please make sure your computer speakers or headset volume is turned up. For the best viewing experience, we recommend closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. This will help conserve your bandwidth. Some networks cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are not progressing, press F5 on your keyboard or Command+R for Mac, and this will refresh the page. We will be using interactive polling during the session and encourage you to participate. At the bottom of your screen are multiple widgets, and I'd like to highlight a few of these. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A widget. We will try to answer these during the session, but if we run out of time, we will answer them via email. Additional materials are available in the resources list. Please download those you may find useful, and you can find out more about our speakers today via the Speaker Bios widget. We will be recording today's session, and the on-demand version of the webcast will be shared with you via email within the next few days. Finally, we value your feedback, so please do complete the pop-up survey at the end of the webcast. Our moderator today is Shay Sedanius, the Global Head of Financial Crime and Industry Affairs at Refinitiv. Over to you, Shay.
Thank you very much, Leanne, and a very warm welcome to all of you who've joined us for today's financial crime discussion series. As Leanne mentioned, this is the third installment, and then really the intent is to share with you some of the thought leaders and some of the trends happening in the financial crime space. We've been lucky enough to hear from leaders talking about wildlife trafficking and modern day slavery. And today we turn our attention specifically to Europe, really to talk about the unprecedented legislative amendments and proposals currently underway. And we welcome Bertrand Hewitt, who's the Senior Vice President and Senior Partner at FleishmanHillard, who's an expert in this field, to share his thoughts on not only the AML package that's expected to be published in July this month, but also a series of other proposals as well that, as a culmination of all of them, are quite significant policy developments. So as a very quick introduction, Fleischman is a leader in this space in terms of following these policy developments. Bertie himself is no stranger to not only the policy developments in Brussels overall, but he is a co-head of the financial services practice and head of technology practice at Fleischman. So I cannot think of a better speaker to join us on this incredible topic. So as a running order, I'm going to invite Bertie to share his thoughts for about 20 minutes or so. Then we'll turn our attention to Q&A. And I encourage all of you to participate, to take the advantage of the real insight that Bertie can share with us, really to address not only what we see as some of the problems that have been identified, but also some of the specific policy proposals, and whether or not, in fact, the AML action plan that will be published in July will, in fact, address some of the weaknesses that have been identified. Some of the scandals in Europe we all know about in terms of banks and other organizations that have run into trouble because of money laundering weaknesses. The AML action plan is a way to address some of those. And so before we give over to Bertie to share her thoughts, maybe we can ask a polling question and take a temperature of all of you out there in whether, in fact, you think, for those of you who follow these things, what you think the biggest impediments to a more effective AML framework are globally. And so if I can ask our team to bring that question up, again, share your thoughts in terms of what you think are the biggest impediments in this space. Is there a lack of cooperation among the public and private sector that some have called for? The lack of consistency from a legislative perspective, lack of commitment from the industry, or the last one, whether data privacy, in fact, is an impediment to more cooperation and information sharing that's very much being promoted in many different jurisdictions globally, including Europe. So if we could reflect on that a bit. And then I'll ask Bertie not only to reflect on the results, but also reflect on his opening comments and presentation on getting a sense of where we are. So if we could show the results in a few moments, and then we can proceed with Bertie's presentation. Let's see if we can get the responses up. So this is interesting. So it's an interesting breakdown. So almost 23% think that there's a lack of public and private sector cooperation, something that we have been promoting in terms of more cooperation, more information sharing, lack of consistency, lack of commitment from the industry. 15% is the least voted result, and then data privacy, 17%. I think that data privacy impedes information sharing. So Bertie, first of all, very much welcome. Please reflect on some of the answers there, and I invite you to share your opening remarks with us. Very much welcome.
Thank you, Che. Good day, everyone. Yes, lack of consistency, interesting, and perhaps and hopefully what Europe is about to embark on in its next reform will help reduce the numbers a little bit when we next poll on this. As Che said, we have a major package coming up still on the 6th of July, it is expected. And what I want to cover in the next 25 minutes or so, 4 areas in particular. One, it's helpful to understand the political drivers behind yet another reform of AML and CTF. Secondly, I want to take you through some of the key changes that we expect to see come up next week. Thirdly, I'd like to go through some of the issues that we expect to be particularly hotly debated as part of the negotiations that will begin. And finally, look at the broader landscape beyond AML and CTF to other policy areas that are developing and which relate quite closely, in some cases, to the AML CTF agenda. Just a health warning to begin with. I need to be clear that what I will talk about is based on our best guesstimate of what is to come out, based on statements made by Commission and other officials at public events, of course, also informed by discussions that we've had, and of course also informed by the Commission Action Plan last year. So with this, I will kick off with a little bit of a political backdrop to this reform. Because you can ask, we've only just finished AML D5. June 2018, when it came into force, it's only a year and a half since the member state implementation deadline has passed. So why are we doing another reform? Well, quite a few things have happened since then. As you know, Che, you mentioned one of them, of course, in the months that preceded and followed the adoption of AML D5, the European banking system found itself embroiled in a number of AML-related cases leading to fines, restrictions on operations, closures of branches, and in some cases, closures of the banks themselves, and not just in 1 or 2 member states in Europe. That was over 9 member states that this happened. So policymakers and regulators began to realize that money laundering had the potential to bring down the entire European banking system, and that money laundering had become a financial stability issue. And this, of course, spurred the Parliament into action. The so-called Tax 3 Special Committee on Financial Crime, Tax Evasion, and Tax Avoidance published a report in March 2019, including lots of calls on both the Commission and on member states to take further action to improve the AML framework. And one of the MEPs that is really leading that fight and calling as far as a creation of a new European FBI, Sven Giegel from Germany, a Green MEP, has been really active and still is on this and will play a leading part in the negotiations to come. The member states, of course, also got into action. They produced their own decisions as a group in council, also recommending a number of short-term actions and longer-term actions for the Commission to take forward to reform the framework. Now, with that political pressure mounting on both sides of the European House, there was a little choice for the incoming Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, in the middle here, to make the fight against financial crime a priority of her manifesto coming into office in November 2019. And what is interesting in how she positioned this whole issue is how she positioned this as an internal security matter, but under the chapter of her manifesto entitled Protecting the European Way of Life. And that is important because by doing this, she was bringing the entire EU values agenda, which is going to be very much at play because that agenda includes the protection of EU fundamental rights, which includes protection of data protection and privacy. And as we know, and we saw in the questions that was asked, and we'll come back to it, is an important issue in the AML debate. So two big political drivers of the upcoming agenda: financial stability and internal security linked to EU values, linked to data privacy. The third big political driver is, of course, related to the COVID-19 crisis management and recovery situation that we're in. The Commission has noted the excellent report by Europol at the end of last year on how COVID-19 related crime has infected Europe in 2019. And it shows very well how it has led to, in particular, distribution of counterfeit and substandard goods, fraud schemes, and further money laundering activities. And with billions of taxpayer money spent by member states and the European Union itself to keep the economy afloat, expect a level of political attention to this sixth reform that we've not seen before. Now, COVID-related activities, of course, were facilitated by the increased network connectivity and online activities through digitalization, also generating heightened cybercrime activities. And here we can expect a very passionate debate on the role of technological developments, both as a facilitator of financial crime, as just said, but also as an enabler, of course, of a more effective toolkit to fight financial crime. The final political driver of this reform is, of course, the evolution of the global standards on AML and CTF. The Commission understands full well that financial crime is a global phenomenon, and it will want to reflect latest recommendations that have come out from FATF, in particular since June 2018, for example, in the area of virtual asset service providers. So I hope this provides some useful political backdrop to to the upcoming reform, to understand the dynamics that will be at play. And now I want to turn and look at some of the specifics and some of the key changes that we expect to see. So here you go. One big change, of course, significant to all of you and the entire private sector ecosystem, depending, business by business, of course, is the introduction of a new regulation. And that new regulation will contain the obligations that currently apply to obliged entities in the current framework. And the objective is to create a single rule book for AML in Europe. And this is very much to respond to, as you said, Che, one of the big criticism of the current framework, which was, in that case, that a lot of those provisions were not being implemented by member states in a consistent manner, and therefore reduced, the effectiveness of the overall framework. Another mega change is going to be the creation of a new European AML Authority. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but from a business impact perspective, just a couple of points. One, it will have potentially significant cost of business implications, as it will rely on private sector funding alongside EU public funding. And two, it will likely be armed with important fining and sanctioning powers vis-a-vis the obliged entities that will fall under its direct supervision. Another important change is that some form of oversight is going to be introduced in the non-financial sector, for the so-called designated non-financial business professions. And that, again, is in response to a common criticism that much of the money laundering and terrorist financing activity is also happening outside of the financial sector. Not quite clear yet. We'll see next week how all of this will be articulated, but that's a new thing. Also expect proposed mechanisms for the exchange of information and cooperation between FIUs. And that, from a parliament perspective, is the area that they've criticized the most as getting in the way of a more effective framework, and things will be proposed there as well to improve that. Now, if you look to the actual obligations themselves of the obliged entities, we are expecting a strengthening of the customer due diligence processes. We're expecting clarifications and potential increased requirements in relation to ultimate beneficial ownership transparency. We're expecting increased requirements on the crypto assets sector beyond the VASPs. We're expecting countermeasures against third countries with strategic deficiencies on AML CTF to be harmonized through the new regulation. Not on this slide, but I know very dear to compliance people's heart is the transaction reporting regime. Well, I'm afraid we don't know very much about this at this stage, but it's not one of the big items that's been identified as being reformed. We'll see. Another change, also not on this slide, which we've picked up and you should be aware of, is that there are discussions about also introducing upper limits on cash payments. And that idea is very much inspired from an existing regulation that governs cash border controls, the amount of cash that you can take across borders in Europe. And in that regulation, you have an upper limit of 10,000 euros. That's the number that's being thought about at the moment as a potential number to also introduce when it comes to upper limits on cash payments. Voila. So just to help you visualize what will likely go into the new regulation from a obliged entity obligations perspective and what will likely remain in the directive, that's more the member state side of the obligation here. You can look at this later in your own way. There's two of the instruments coming out next week. The third one is the directive setting up the new dedicated European AML Authority. And I want to spend just a few minutes on this because that's a major change. It's a completely new supervisory contract for the AML and CTF sector and potentially beyond. So the current thinking, well, the latest thinking, again, caveat might evolve a little bit in the next week, but the current thinking is that this new AML authority will have three primary duties or mandates. One, it will have direct supervisory powers, starting slowly with what will be identified as largest and most high-risk cross-border obliged entities in the financial sectors. And the model that it will be inspired from is one that the large credit institutions are already familiar with, which is that of the single supervisory mechanism, the SSM, with the SSM's joint supervisory team, including the ECB and the relevant regulators, where all these large institutions, of course, are present as part of that team. So that's the model that they have in mind. The second role will be one of indirect supervision. And here the idea is to provide some sort of overseeing of what the national supervisors, how they are supervising other obliged entities. So here we're talking about those obliged entities in financial services that are not subject to direct supervision, as well as obliged entities in the non-financial sector, the ENFBPs, like tax advisors, etc., notaries and corporate service providers. However, in exceptional circumstances, the AML authority could also take direct oversight of these entities in cases that still need to be clarified as to what the criteria are for that to happen. The third role of that agency will be to foster the cooperation between the FIUs. So the idea is that the FIUs would benefit from the AML Authority setting standards for supervisory approaches, also help coordinate the network. And the big question mark is whether the FIU.net will end up also being part of that new AML Authority or stay with the Commission. So these are the three main functions. And on top of this, existing regulatory bodies such as the European Banking Authority, which is already playing a standard-setting role in AML, as we saw most recently with the revised risk factor guidelines on money laundering and terrorist financing. That role is expected to continue, of course, as a standard setter. And then the Commission is also talking about creating a think tank, which will help identify trends, research, data, and track, how the landscape is developing. Again, it's not very clear at this stage what that forum will consist of. In terms of timing, we are expecting the proposal to suggest that the authority is set up by 2024 and can start with its direct supervisory obligation by the end of 2026. So that's for the new supervisory construct. Now, let's look at what we expect to be some of the big issues that are going to be discussed or unresolved. I say unresolved because I'll start with the public-private partnership point. One thing you did not see in the what goes where slide I showed before is a reference to PPPs, but that is simply because it's not part of the package that's coming. However, what may come with the package or around the time the package comes out is a consultation by the Commission on proposed guidance on public-private partnership, because the Commission has announced that it would like to provide guidance on PPPs by the end of 2021. So there could be likely to be a consultation on this coming out as well, alongside the package. Another issue we expect to be discussed quite significantly is, of course, the scope of obliged entities, in particular, both in the financial services and in the non-financial services space. So in the financial sector space, of course, there will be a lot of discussion in the banking sector, what the criteria should be to identify the large and high-risk obliged entities that will come under direct supervision of the new AML Authority. We expect to see a greater debate also around the whole digital asset / digital currency space, given and a potential extension of the scope in this sector, given a lot of the noise around central bank digital currencies, digital euro, the regulation that's currently ongoing in Europe for the regulation of the crypto asset sector. So there will be, I think, discussions on this as well. In the non-financial services space, I think there will be a discussion, of course, around the scope of the DNFBPs. And this is an area, for example, where there isn't consistent implementation across Europe, for example, in relation to crowdfunding platforms or diamond dealers. The big, one of the most, if not the most politically sensitive debate will be around supervision. I think it's really important because we're all going to be very focused on, is the framework a lot more effective from also a technical perspective, but that's where the politics are going to be. It's about, sovereignty, transfer of competencies by national, member states to a potential Uber EU regulator. The Parliament is traditionally more in favor of centralized supervision, will likely be pushing for more powers of the EU AML Authority. The member states, of course, will be resisting giving up parts of their national sovereignty on this issue. So there's all going to be about how is it all articulated, who is responsible for what, where do you draw the line in terms of who have authority over what, and that will be a very, very big discussion. The other hot discussion, of course, will relate to GDPR. I'm sure most people, a lot of the results are interesting. 17% see GDPR as a potential obstacle, and we all know the tension between the data maximization approach that is embedded in any financial crime regulation, of course, including AML, versus the data minimization approach that is embedded in GDPR by definition, because of the fundamental right to privacy point. So clarification on the interaction between the two frameworks is something the industry has been calling for a long time. It's also something the member states in their latest conclusion have been calling for. And the Commission line is still that the AML package will not touch GDPR. It's a political minefield, and the Commission says that it still needs to get more concrete evidence from the industry that GDPR or how GDPR is impeding AML obligation. Of course, the Commission can ask the European Data Protection Board to provide clarity, but careful what you wish for. And in fact, the EDPB has already fired the first shot last month in a letter to the Commission, in which it asked the Commission to include in the upcoming package a pretty large set of recommendations, just to mention a few. So they're asking for clarification of the general conditions governing the lawfulness of processing by obliged entities and the personal data that is provided by third parties, the types of data which are subject to the processing of personal data in the context of AML-CTF. They're asking to create a specific legal framework, potentially, for watch lists and to clarify the responsibilities between obliged entities and those watch list providers. They're asking to include legal obligation for obliged entities to implement appropriate data protection policies on the processing of personal data for AML-CTF purposes. So that's GDPR. The last thing I wanted to draw attention to, which will not necessarily be obvious initially, it's the national dimension of the reform. And the Commission, as I said, is aware financial crime is a global phenomenon that requires a global response. But it also knows that its greatest export is regulation. And it has every intention to promote the upcoming framework as an international standard. It is, of course, needs to get into FATF a little more to help achieve that, and it is discussing with member states how to create a more unified voice within FATF than is potentially currently the case on an issue like this one. So there is that agenda at play. The other thing I just want to flag is the potential implication on frictions with third countries that this framework could potentially bring with it. We all know about the AML CTF blacklisting piece of that dimension, but there is also another dimension which often people don't realize, is that compliance with AML CTF EU regulation is increasingly becoming part of what is known as the European equivalence assessment process, which is basically the financial services term for market access to European markets. So in other words, if you're a firm in a non-EU country wanting to access the EU market, you don't have a presence in Europe, you're wanting to access the EU market for, let's say, trading purposes, you will have to show that the regulatory regime under which you operate is at least as strong as the one in Europe. But that assessment is at the discretion of the Commission. And in that assessment, there is, in the last few regulations we've seen in financial services, a requirement that even if you're found equivalent, if your AML regime is not as compliant, as strong as the EU regime, you can still not get equivalence. So it's a market access issue. It's a political bargaining tool for the Commission to potentially prevent market access. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the Brexit context with the UK. There is, of course, a high-level agreement in the EU-UK trade agreement already. It is very high level about maintaining cooperation, taking into account FATF standards, maintaining up-to-date information on beneficial ownership. But again, the UK has become a third country, like any other third country, and it will be treated as such by the Commission for blacklisting purposes, but also for access in general. So the agenda for divergence has already been made quite clear by the UK. If it goes into the AML, there will be this sort of issues coming up as well. Okay, moving on to and finishing off with the broader landscape around the reform itself, because there's a lot going on. Firstly, we have a whole set of, let's call them, enforcement / judicial cooperation sanctions sort of initiative that are also underway. The Commission published a strategy a couple of weeks ago to tackle serious crime and organized crime, in which it basically sets up a EU prosecutor's office that was set up on the 1st of June. Now, at the moment, its mandate is very focused on prosecuting against crimes against the European budget, but everyone is looking at this as a potential future pan-EU prosecutor for financial crime cases more broadly. Another thing that is happening is the mandate of the EU recovery asset recovery offices is being strengthened, and there's a consultation that's just come out by the Commission. Another area is boosting law enforcement, and again there is a negotiation currently around the updated Europol founding regulation. Sanctions, the sanctions policy in Europe is really also gone up a gear. There is a much tougher stance that is taken towards sanction. Commission is setting up a database for member states to report and exchange information on their enforcement of sanctions, and also creating a system for anonymous reporting of sanctions evasion. You may have seen the external action services in Europe being a lot more active in the last couple of years on sanctions. And of course, we're all aware of the recent ones around Russia and Belarus. Now, also worth noting is that what's called the green agenda is inviting itself more and more into the AML and CTF agenda. It is no accident that the human trafficking strategy was published alongside the serious and organized crime strategy, because there's also in there a direct reference to this proposal, the sustainable corporate governance proposal, which the Commission is also about to come out with. And the relevance of this from an AML CTF perspective is that this is an area where there will be increased KYC and customer due diligence requirements going right through the whole supply chain due diligence process. And also telling that the Commission has made its upcoming review of the Environmental Crime Directive in Q4 this year, part of its strategy as well to fight serious and organized crime. So that's for the green strategy inviting itself into the AML CTF debate. The other agenda that is inviting itself into this discussion is the digital policy agenda. 2 months ago, you may have seen an agreement on the regulation to address the dissemination of terrorist content online. That's one. At the moment, there is a discussion on the revisions for the cybersecurity legal framework, which makes no mystery that it is very much looking at this graded framework to contribute to the fight against money laundering and terrorism. You have ongoing negotiations on the so-called Digital Services Act, which is the regulation that upgrades the e-commerce directive from 20 years ago and now regulates online platforms. And in there, guess what? There are new KYBC, they call them, requirements, very strongly inspired from the AML framework, But that agenda is also going into the online marketplace debate. And of course, this is also linked to the whole digitalization phenomenon I mentioned at the beginning, and the risks of financial crime, going into that area. Be also aware, I think, that the EID proposal has come out as well in Europe, and of course, it's very closely, in fact, will directly relate to the AML CFT discussion because of the onboarding aspect, which this proposal is also looking to facilitate when it comes to CDD KYC. There's a raging debate on central bank digital currencies and creation of digital euros. Well, why is that relevant to AML? Again, last week on a panel, a board member of the ECB, of course, is working on the creation of a digital euro, said, and I quote, "I don't know how we do KYC, AML, CTFs, etc. We're central bankers." So there is something also there, potential opportunities, I suspect, as well, coming with this, but that will be an important discussion as well as part of that agenda. And final word on artificial intelligence. Now, clearly, machine learning, artificial intelligence applications are tools that are being developed to help improve the fight against financial crime by both the public and private sector. Here, again, we also have legislation that has been proposed 2 months ago in April, which has 43, 50 references to financial crime. And of course, it's in relation to the use of AI for financial crime detection purposes. In a nutshell, there are three, the artificial intelligence is being put into 3 buckets. One is outright ban, and that includes real-time biometric surveillance in public spaces for law enforcement purposes, but with exceptions under specific circumstances, with prior authorization, details not fleshed out yet. So outright ban on that. Then there is a high-risk category, which is not outright ban, but where massive regulatory obligations come with being high risk. And that includes AI systems for detecting crime, specifically when used by law enforcement authorities. And there are 6 very specific cases that are listed in the regulation. Now, interestingly, an earlier draft before it was published of that proposal included also private sector use cases for fraud detection and AML. That has gone, but it may well resurface, and we expect it will resurface in the debate. And as you can imagine, there's a big GDPR dimension to this debate as well. And of course, the EDPB is already all over this, wanting to ban any use of biometric identification, even by law enforcement, without exception. The third category is, less risky use of AI application, where there's just transparency requirements, code of conduct being encouraged, etc. I'll stop here. I think that's just about 25 minutes, but just slightly over. I hope it's given you a good overview of what to expect, why it's coming, what will be in there, and the other things that are happening around this, and where the big discussion items will be. Happy to take on any question. Back to you, Chair.
No, thank you, Bertie. And well, first of all, phenomenal job in walking us through, as we can all appreciate, a legislative packages. There's 13 of them from what I counted on that slide alone, and giving us a comprehensive overview in a very short period of time. But as you can all imagine, this is, it's going to be have tremendous impact in the industry overall, in addition to obviously the discussion around, central supervision versus member state supervision. So there's lots of streams of thought here to go through. But what I'll do is, before we turn to the audience questions that have come in hard and fast, is actually to reflect and maybe get a poll on everything that Bertie has discussed, presented, in terms of the measures that are being discussed and the measures that are going to find its way through regulation, which of course is directly transposed to national legislation, whether these efforts in fact is going to improve the fight against financial crime at the end of the day. And we'll be fairly binary here. Do you expect that all these reforms, public-private partnerships, UBO, public registry reform, etc., do you think that these are measures that will improve the fight against financial crime, or those who think that this is not enough, or these aren't the right policy priorities, or for those who maybe need to see more details, as we of course all await for the AML legislative package to be published in July. So it'll be interesting, Bertie, if given everything that you've gone through in your presentation, whether the argument's been made that this is the right direction, that the fight against financial crime will be more effective tomorrow than it is today. But certainly we'll see. And I should also add, by the way, while we wait for the results, that we've broken records here in terms of number of registrations, and they're really broken up by region as well. So clearly, a significant portion for those based in Europe. But we also have registrants from the Americas, from APAC as well. So this certainly reflects the growing interest on all these packages and the implications of them from a business impact perspective. So if we can get the results, we'll reflect on that, and then I will jump straight into some of the audience questions. Okay, so that's interesting. There is, in fact, a slight majority that thinks that these reforms will improve the effectiveness in Europe, but there's also a significant 39% or so that actually need to see the details of this. So clear, will be a beginning part of a discussion and reflection once some of these packages are actually published. So let me reflect quickly now with the audience questions, and I'll try to get to as many of these as possible. And I appreciate we only have 15 minutes, and there's lots of questions. And some of these may not be an answer to, but first, Bertie, there's a question here regarding, do you actually see that this new EU AML body, how do you see that body working effectively with other international bodies like the Financial Action Task Force or Moneyval and other organizations to kind of work cohesively on these issues?
It's a great question, and I wish I knew, the answer, or could be, confident in my answer. It's hard to see because a lot of it don't forget, this is also just the proposal, right? It will be negotiated to death. So what comes out of that sausage making process is, it's hard to tell. At the end of the day, there is clearly a movement post-Brexit to increase more centralized supervision in Europe. You see it here, you see it in other digital files, you see it in the audit sector. So there is an opportunity seen for Europe to take, that next step forward. But it's such a sensitive, topic, especially on one which, like this one, because of the transfer of sovereignty potentially involved. I think it all depends, at the end of the day, on where the mandate ends up being agreed, and whether that mandate provides an international mandate as well for that authority to be, the connecting point with other agencies in the rest of the world, and how much support it has in doing so. It's going to be very important. There's no question they will play a role in that international coordination. I think the focus initially is going to be very much getting the EU house in order, and how you make, how you provide clarity within the EU. Is going to be hard enough to get, them to play a role in helping the FIUs coordinate and etc. Then that's going to be the primary focus thing. The international dimension is going to be, a secondary matter, at least at the beginning. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I suspected there wasn't a clear answer to that, but certainly it does reflect that the EU is taking its role more seriously, I think, going forward in terms of how it works in international bodies like FATF and others. And then, of course, we have GDPR. So there's a question here regarding, although GDPR is an unresolved issue, what do you think about GDPR versus AML? Should the data processing regulations like sanctions, PEP, Will they have implications in terms of mitigating measures that organizations need to make? Now, just to pipe in on that, as you reflect on that question, on the EDPB letter, European Data Protection Board letter to the European Commission, there's one section, of course, talks about the 6 recommendations that are in there, and I encourage everyone to have a look at it or make sure that it's available. It was published on the 19th of May. But there's also another section on the second page, third paragraph, that really cuts to the heart of some of the tensions between the two. And the tensions really have to do with, some of the trends that we're seeing in the money laundering space. We've talked about public-to-private information sharing partnerships. There are efforts to pool data, whether via KYC utilities or other models. There's efforts to drive more network mapping, joint typologies development, more effective case management. So all these issues are aimed to make the fight against financial crime more effective. But of course, some of the data privacy principles, are only resolved, and they've made that quite clear in the letter that you should avoid processing personal data to the best that you can. You should separate data pooling measures, limit the detail of personal data, and breaking the link between event subjects and the personal data itself. So clearly, these are issues that do need to be resolved, and this will particularly come into fruition when it comes to sanctions policy and PEP data, which organizations by their very nature have to abide by. So any reflections further on how this is going to resolve itself, what your sense is, and how these two regulatory regimes will find a common ground, as it were, and provide more clarity.
Well, I mean, you've already said a lot, Che, on this. The real challenge is that in the new geopolitical order that we are in, and if you recall how the Commission is now really intent on carving out its own, there's a whole, what they call the strategic autonomy agenda, which they're pushing very hard. Now, one distinguishing factor that they keep pushing and they see as a competitive advantage is, that's why I mentioned it at the beginning, European values. So, and there isn't a willingness to compromise on that. You see it, in the whole discussion we've had recently, and just concluded, I think, yesterday on the kind of UK-EU data adequacy discussion, the previous, EU-US trains, debacle, etc. They will find a way. I think for me, this is really telling, because I think everyone wants to find a way, and they will find a way, provide some clarity, but they will have to come out as seen as not to have compromised on that value, fundamental right. Don't ask me how they will do it, but I think the signals are, we know there is an issue. We want to work through it to find a way to provide more clarification that is helpful also for the fight against financial crime, clearly, and all those involved in this. But this cannot be, and it's very important for the industry to also, not, if progress is made, if little things are given that help clarify, that it's not, banded as, the security people want against the privacy people. That's really, it's so sensitive. So they will find a way, but it will have to be seen as not on having compromised on privacy, fundamental right.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And then there's a question here about public registries. Clearly, there's a global agenda on enhancing UBO's ultimate beneficial ownership registries. The G7 recently announced that that's a priority. We know through our conversations at the B20 that it's a priority. And the question here really is about, will there be one EU registry, or will be, will national registries continue to operate? That we know from the AML action plan package anyway, that they're meant to be interoperable. How are we going to get there? We have a long way to go, because then you have to address data standards and formatting standards, etc. But that is my understanding, that they will continue to use the national registries and make them interoperable and not create a single registry. But you may have heard differently, Bertie, on your end.
No, and I forgot to mention, yes, you kindly described me as an expert to an extent, yes, but I have somebody who's even more of an expert than I am in the team, Guillaume, who is able to jump in as well and may be able to provide a bit more details on this. So you're right, there is a global agreement, G7, G20, in fact, as well. They're going to start with a closer linking up of the registries at a member state level. It's so close to this sort of sovereignty point that the tension at the moment is to make that mechanism work better and connecting the national registries. I cannot see an EU centralized registry emerge. Remember, Europe works on incremental basis, right? The big, difficult political call, especially when there's a transfer of sovereignty, it's a sort of little step at a time. I don't know, Guillaume, if you want to add anything on this, but that's my understanding.
No, your understanding is completely correct. This is one of the pieces that remains also in the directive as a member state obligations, and they're looking at working on interoperability for now. They won't move into a single UBO for now, at least on this package.
Thank you very much, Guillaume. And just continuing, again, I'm going to try to work through as many of these questions as possible. It's hard to keep up, but I think it's great. It shows certainly an interest in this topic. The football industry. Do you foresee that the football industry will be brought into the scope of EU AML regulations as part of this new package? And this is an interesting question, because we know that Europol, in fact, published a report last year on corruption in sports, particularly focusing on game match fixing, and also focusing on the two biggest industries in this, which is football, of course, which we can appreciate the significance of that sport, but also tennis. And certainly what they revealed is a significant size industry as far as match fixings and the amount of money that's circulating. I think they came out with a number of around $2 trillion converted into euros, which is about 10% of EU's GDP. So any sense, Guillaume or Bertie, on whether the football industry more specifically will be brought in and will be a focus?
Well, I don't know if the person who asked the question knows that I'm French, so bringing up that question this morning is very, very painful for me. I do hope Mbappe gets caught up somehow. No, sorry, I'm joking. But I think it's the gambling industry is clearly already potentially part of the designated non-financial business professions. They actually were at an event like a couple of weeks ago, and they're mobilizing clearly and knowing that they're going to be looked at quite closely. I think it would be very difficult to single out any particular sport. But I don't know, Guillaume, if we've got any more information on this.
Here again, as you say, it's going to be on the DNFPBs, looking in the future. But then again, the AML rules are coming from the Financial Services Directorate from the Commission, so they're a bit less into this part of the space. So they'll leave the new regulatory body, maybe the new EU supervisory body, try and figure something out there. Although they will be under a lot of pressure also from the European Parliament on this, because they have previously discussed this in hearings. Taxi 3 talked about football specifically, and I think even today the tax committee on a separate issue is again talking about these things. So yes, something to watch out for sure.
Yeah, and if I could actually share with the audience, we did a webinar on this particular topic, in fact, last year with Europol and FIFA. So we welcome you to and we'll share that webinar with you if you're interested in this topic, which we thought was interesting. We just have a few minutes left, and we're going to wrap up here. I guess the last one, and we'll have to be quick on this, and then we'll hand over to our organizers. Environmental crime. So we also saw a statement by the G7 on environmental crime. FATF, in fact, yesterday published a report on environmental crime, and we've seen statements by Interpol, Europol. We ourselves as a company have focused on what we call green crime, which is the interlinkages between different criminal activity impacting our environment. Do you see that this is going to be another focus from an EU perspective? And how do you think that issue is going to not only focus within the AML package potentially, but other related packages on corporate due diligence or other topics? Bertie?
Short answer.
Quick answer, yeah, short answer.
Yeah, definitely massive. I mentioned it. The two big pillars on which Commission and European politicians see a way out of COVID and an opportunity related to COVID, which is the green transition, fight against climate change, bringing in everything links back to that agenda, and everything links back to the digital transition agenda. The two, they call it, the president of the coalition commission, all the commissioners keep talking about the twin transition, from which everything falls. So everything gets linked back into how, at every specific issue, we are feeding into supporting those agendas at the higher political levels. So they will get bigger and bigger. There's no question.
Well, I know we can continue. We could have continued this, and I apologies for all the questions that I wasn't able to get to. But clearly, it's a sign of real interest. So first of all, let me thank you, Bertie and Guillaume, for a fantastic presentation. I encourage everyone to seek out Bertie and Fleischman. We'll share the presentation that we went through. We're about to conclude the first part of the financial crime discussion series before we all take, I think, a deserved summer break. We're planning to do more of these sessions in the fall. So I encourage you all to give us a note, send us comments on particular topics that you'd like us to tee up. They can include, if you want to hear from David Lewis, from Executive Director of FATF or Interpol, or if there's particular topics and subjects that you'd like for us to cover, then please do share your comments and feedback as well. These are meant really to be as interactive as possible and really highlight some trends that we're seeing and invite global experts in this field. So again, thank you very much for joining. Again, Bertie, Fleischman, and Guillaume. Let me hand it over to our team with some administrative housekeeping items. And again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Shay. Thank you once again to our speakers and for joining us today. There is a survey that will pop up on your screen. As Shay mentioned, it'd be great if you could just give us that feedback on any topics you'd like to see. And once again, thanks for your time, and that will conclude today's webinar. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.